So last talk by Fabian Bernhardt before we segue into a closing discussion. Fabian Bernhardt is a postdoctoral researcher at the CRC Affective Societies. He holds a PhD from Free University, which is going to be published in just a few weeks now with Mattes and Seitz Berlin, and is entitled Revenge on a Blind Spot of Modernity. Fabian has a background in philosophy as well as cultural anthropology, and his current research evolves around ghosts and what they mean in colonial contexts. Together with Jonas Benz, Deborah Medeiros, and Verena Straub, he is the initiator of the Affect and Colonialism Web Lab, funded by the German Research Foundation, which is going to be launched this year in August. His publications include a monograph on forgiveness, published in 2014, and most recently, a working paper for the CRC Affective Societies on affective stasis. And today, Fabian will talk about affective afterlife, ghostly history.
Thanks, Enrique, for the kind introduction. Since we are already a bit late, I will start right away. Maybe just one technical remark in advance. I will be reading from my screen, which means that I won't see you. So if there will be any flickering because my connection tends to be moody, just shout at me so that I won't keep talking into a void. So my talk is divided into 3 parts. The first part is on reading otherwise than blackness. The second one is on thinking history. And the third is on affective afterlife. On reading otherwise than blackness. Reading can be an affective experience, no matter whether it is a novel, a poem, or a piece of philosophy. The act of reading affects you in a certain way. It elicits certain thoughts and, maybe more importantly, it elicits certain feelings, an affective response. So, to begin with, I would like to describe the affective response the reading of Tyrone Palmer's paper, Otherwise Than Blackness, elicited in me. To do so, I am afraid I can't help to start on a personal note. Not too long ago, the mother of a friend died. I know this friend for many years now. Occasionally, she would start to talk about her mother, sharing bits and pieces, fragments of a family past that assembled to a rather dreary and desolate picture. The mother had serious drug issues which overshadowed their relationship and put a distance between them. My friend spent much time with the mother during her last days, taking leave, talking, trying to sort things out and maybe find some sort of closure or conciliation. It didn't work this way. My mother died under circumstances which to call calm, peaceful, or even reconciled would strongly miss not only the character of her passing, but also the character of the way they departed from each other. I only found out about all this 2 or 3 weeks later, when we happened to meet on the street and she told me about it. I didn't know what to say. Of course, the message did not leave me unaffected. I felt with her, partly out of simple-minded empathy, partly out of a sense of shared experience. Both of us share what is called a mixed ethnic background and, more importantly, her story reminded me of the relation to my own father, whom I neither loved nor mourned when he died. Yet, I did not know what to say. A twisted structure of feeling, to borrow Raymond Williams's term, took hold of me. On the one hand, there was this feeling that I should say something, that it was expected from me to say something, offer some sort of comfort or consolation. On the other hand, however, I overwhelmingly felt that anything I possibly could say would wound up to be wrong, inappropriate, or even indecent. Language failed me. If I remembered correctly, all I did utter in the end with some generic phrases like "I'm sorry" or "tell me if you need something." In the face of death, we all become stupid. I do, at least. End of personal note. The reason why I am telling this is because this twisted structure feeling comes closest to how I felt after reading Otherwise Than Blackness. Trying to respond to this work was like trying to respond to a friend who just told you that their mother died. The message strongly affects you. On the one hand, you feel urged to respond, perform some kind of consoling gesture. But at the same time, there is a sense of hesitation, the overwhelming feeling that everything you could say would end up being wrong, false, and inappropriate. That each response would necessarily miss the essential point of this paper. Of course, it is possible to talk about this piece of philosophy in an academic manner, either praising or condemning its uncompromisingness, radicality, and boldness. Swaying back and forth, I tend to end up on the side of praise. The architecture of this paper is elegant, and the argument artfully crafted. In its uncompromising solidity, Palmer's concept of blackness stands like a fortress. There's no crack in it. Built on the tradition of Afro-pessimism, it rejects any affirmative gesture. Each attempt to enter it from a different ground seems to bounce off immediately. However, it might be that trying to find a crack or soften the edges of this building is not the right way to deal with it anyway. Palmer's vision of blackness is not up for any gesture aiming at conciliation or appeasement. Reading Otherwise Than Blackness and facing this vision, I feel neither entitled nor competent to respond appropriately, for personal and for philosophical reasons. It was not until 1 or 2 years ago that I started to read and engage with Black scholarship. I am only starting to become acquainted with the corpus and tradition of Black studies. My philosophical socialization has been a different one. To give you just one example, when reading the title of Palmer's text, Otherwise Than Blackness, the first reference that came into my mind was not Ashton Crowley, whom I didn't know before, and his notion of the otherwise, but Emmanuel Levinas' Otherwise Than Being or Beyond Essence. In fact, I believe that Palmer's philosophical project and the one of Levinas aim in directions which have more in common than one might think at first glance. Against this backdrop, the best thing that I can do in dealing with Palmer's philosophy is trying to pick up some motives and sketch out some pathways which might form a fragile connection between his work and the questions I am primarily concerned with. Questions around the issues of historical injustice and violence, irreversibility, the relation between the living and the dead, affective afterlife, and what Avery Gordon calls ghostly matters. How could such a connection look like? Otherwise Than Blackness begins with a critique of relationality and the concept of the world. Put simply, maybe too simply, Palmer's argument is the following. The world is anti-black, and this makes relationality an ontological trap for blackness. Palmer writes, quote, when brought to bear with the question and reality of blackness, the radical openness of the world represented by affect is shown to have an unthought racial underside. This purported openness rests on the foreclosure of blackness and the relentless exposure of blackness to gratuitous violence. End of quote. Apparently, there are many ways of conceptualizing the world. What all these concepts have in common, though, is that they envision the world as a structure of containment. encapsulating the totality of all things, beings, and relations. Understanding the world as a relational container of all things implies understanding it against an imaginary background which is organized by spatiality. The totality of the world is roughly conceived of as a spatial totality which contains all relations within itself. So, what happens when you shift focus from the spatial paradigm to the paradigm of temporality? The view then is redirected from the totality of the world to the totality of history. If the metaphysical law of the world is relationality, and if the world is dependent on the foreclosure and of the duration of blackness, then what is the law of history? Irreversibility and destruction. And I now come to the second part, thinking history. How could a way of thinking history look like that does not shy away from the ongoing atrocities produced by what Palmer calls the anti-black imperative? Asked differently, how can one think history in a way that tries to apprehend the overall negativity produced by colonial modernity? I believe that any attempt to think of history in this way must start from two irrefutable facts. Fact one, nothing that has happened can be made unhappen. Impossible undone, as Shakespeare says. The slain are really slain. There's no chance of resurrection, no final day of judgment on which the graves of the dead or the book of history will open again. It is impossible to tear out or to unwrite the chapters that have already been written. The time of history is irreversible. Fact two, the world we live in is shaped by injustice and violence. Since almost 600 years, the beginning of colonial modernity, violence, injustice, dispossession, and destruction have been the signature of historical time. In his propositions on the concept of history, Walter Benjamin evokes the figure of the angel of history to highlight the ongoingness of this process of destruction. His back turned to the future, the angel of history faces the past. Benjamin writes, quote, "Where we see the appearance of a chain of events, he sees one single catastrophe, which unceasingly piles rubble on top of rubble and hurls it before his feet." End of quote. If time is irreversible, so is destruction. When it comes to transatlantic slavery and the Middle Passage, there's another fact which further complicates the task of doing history. There are hardly any records left behind by the enslaved people themselves. Their names, their voices, their stories are largely absent in the archives. History thus faces an epistemological impasse. How can one do justice to those who are not allowed to speak in their own names, who in fact often were not even allowed to name themselves? Almost all historical documents available were produced by those who silenced them. Again, I am reminded of Walter Benjamin, who stated that, quote, "Not even the dead will be safe from the enemy if he is victorious," end of quote. The history of colonial modernity was largely written by the victors. Just like there's an unthought racial underside to the concept of the world, as Palmer contends, there's a concealed and oppressed underside to the progressive concept of history as it was developed by philosophers in the Age of Enlightenment. This foreclosed and forgotten underside, the silenced lives, the nameless dead, the voids in the archives, is what renders history ghostly. If this depiction is accurate, then philosophy of history will have to change the way it proceeds. will have to depart from the logics of presence and representation. We'll have to acknowledge that the past is never fully gone, that the dead might still be among us. In brief, we'll have to reckon with ghosts. Palmer argues that, quote, blackness marks a position of essential irreconcilability with / in the world, end of quote. The same can be said of specters. French philosopher Quentin Meillassoux wrote an essay that opens with the question, what is a spectre? His answer, quote, a dead person who has not been properly mourned, who haunts us, bothers us, refusing to pass over to the other side, where the dearly departed can accompany us at a distance, sufficient for us to live our own lives without forgetting them, but also without dying their death, without being the prisoner of the repetition of their final moments. End of quote. The question seems to be answered, but Meillassoux insists and directly asks again, quote, then what is the essence of the spectre par excellence, end of quote. The second answer reads like a radicalization of the first. Meillassoux writes, a dead person whose death is such that we cannot mourn them, that is to say, a dead person for whom the work of mourning, the passage of time, proves inadequate for a tranquil bond between them and the living to be envisaged. A dead person, the horror of whose death lays heavy not only upon their nearest, but upon all those who cross the path of their history. Essential spectres are those of terrible death. Essential spectres are the dead who will always refuse to pass over, who obstinately cast off their shroud to declare to the living, in spite of all evidence, that they still belong amongst them. Their end attests to no meaning, brings with it no completion. These are not necessarily shadows who declare their revenge, but shadows who cry out beyond all vengeance. End of quote. Affects are the medium in which these shadows first come to the fore. Ontology thus is always a form of affect theory. Behind each ghostly apparition there is an affect, a feeling of unease, an irritation, frightened flinching, an inkling of guilt, shame, or sorrow. And behind each shadowy cry there is an exclamation mark, a vague but indisputable premonition that the dead make certain demands on us. Now come to the third and last part on affective afterlife. Philosophy, Paul Ricoeur once said, begins nowhere absolutely. Sustained by non-philosophy, it lives on the substance of what has already been understood unreflectively. If this is so, then the task of philosophy would be to withstand negativity until the exclamation marks behind the horrors of history turn into question marks. Philosophy would have to unlearn to consider life and death, presence and absence, past and present as mutually exclusive categories. Neither fully dead nor fully alive, neither totally gone nor totally present, neither fully visible nor fully invisible, spectres are unbodily embodiments of that which eludes clear classification. According to Derrida, the question of the ghost is, quote, the question of life, death, beyond the opposition between life and death, end of quote. To turn to them is to confront the unthought ghostly underside of history, the erased lives, the nameless dead, vanished voices and voids in the archives, the singular concrete existences behind a number like 60 millions and more, as it says in the epigraph to Toni Morrison's novel Beloved. The call to confront the ghostly underside of history is synonymous with the call to face the afterlife of a past that, even as repressed and excluded, does not cease to make its demand on the present. However, not only the dead linger on, but also Middle Passage itself. Its ongoing legacy, its wake, continues to deform the present. World and history have one important thing in common. By their very design, both concepts tend to totalization. Reframed in terms of temporality, Césaire's call for the end of the world then would become a call for the end of history, a yearning to escape its totality, a desire to blast its utter continuity. However, just like the end of the world, the end of history cannot be determined in positive terms. It remains unavailable. Relating to the end of the world, Palmer argues that, quote, in Césaire's call, beginning and end function not in a teleological or linear manner, from beginning to end, but as collapsed signs of a paradigmatic break. The end that Césaire calls for is an event of radical contingency and uncertainty, without the promise of something new in the place of the world that must end. End of quote. The same can be said for the end of history. In light of the irreversibility of time, the desire for the end of history becomes a desire aiming at the impossible, reversing the irreversible, making the past undone. Maybe Walter Benjamin felt this desire, and maybe his way of thinking history by drawing on messianism was fueled by this desire. Yet, the messianic end of history is not something to actively strive for. It remains unavailable for a thinking that forbids itself to confound philosophy on the one side and theology or religion on the other. Thus, I will not follow this path any further. Instead, I would like to end by shortly sketching out another thought that brings us back to the past. The dead cannot be brought back to life. Irreversibility forbids it. Conversely, however, it is also true that the fact that they once lived cannot be denied. The same irreversibility that prevents their resurrection at the same time prevents them from falling back into the absolute nothingness of never having been. In other words, the past is indelible. There is a fundamental difference between something that once was and ceased to be, and something that simply is not and never has been. Not being anymore is a different ontological category than not being. This difference, that is, the ontological indelibility of the past, is the condition for engaging with afterlife. I owe this thought to Vladimir Yanklevich, a French philosopher whose work and life vividly testify that he never succumbed to cheap reconciliation. In his own words, the thought reads as follows, quote, "Who has been can from now on no longer not have been. This mysterious and deeply obscure fact of having been is now his viaticum for our time." End of quote. This fact, the ontological indelibility of the past, does not provide any peace or consolation, but at least it provides a way to deal with the affective afterlife and ghostly history of colonial modernity. That's it.
Thank you very much, Fabian.